And we are live with our 204th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. This episode is sponsored by Redpoint Security, code security for coders, right? Or by coders, I should say. We're happy to be back. We've got a whole bunch of news to discuss. We had a really good conversation last week with Shlomi, and that continued on. We're already scheduling him for another episode. But first things first, training. There are still a couple of seats for KernelCon that are available. You're probably never going to find a course as inexpensive, right? Or in such a great location for practical secure code review as KernelCon. So I'll drop the link in there really quick. Please come if you are going to be there, or consider us for one of your training options. Like we've said in the past couple of episodes, we are going to be updating the course, or we're in the process of it right now. New examples, especially open source examples, different apps that we're going to be using to exercise those code review muscles. Outside of that, Ken, anything else, like any place you're going to be upcoming outside of KernelCon?
I'll be in Austin next week, but I don't know that I'll have a lot of time. Let's see. I'll let people know but yeah, I will be in Texas. I will say there will be a few days in the Dallas area that I'm just kind of hanging out.
Nice.
So, anyways, but nothing like other than the KernelCon bits and stuff like that. So
cool.
We're good.
Cool. Yeah, I'll be around. I mean, I just did that trip to Nova of all places, and Ken was gone, of course, but was able to catch up with quite a few listeners. Maybe we got a few new ones today after the talk. I was speaking more on it was called Modern versus Old School, but how we see old school issues and vulnerabilities that we saw, or that I saw 20 plus years ago, still show up in code today, and why that is. It's a talk I think I'm going to reprise, and I'm going to start pushing at other conferences as well. More of kind of a beginner, like what can you do? What can you look for as you're moving into security at an organization, what you should be watching out for. On top, but besides that, right, like I guess that just leads into the first article that I wanted to discuss today, because it's my favorite topic. It's Crocs and socks, baby. Let me drop it in here. So this one, like the link that we've got is from Info Security Magazine. Attack method affect Okta passwords. And yeah, Ken, you were the one that posted this to me because you knew it was right up my alley. But we have this discussion during Practical Secure Code Review when we get to the auditing section, right? When we're talking about logging and about how one of my favorite things that I've seen over the years is this logging of failed passwords, right? That the fact that you'll see somebody try to log in, like user Seth logged in with, or failed to log in password 1, failed to log in password 2, failed to log in password 3, Seth successfully logged in, right? And this is exactly the attack or the issue that's being called out here. But for one of the most common providers that is out there for 2FA and single sign-on, Okta, that in their logs, it looks like, where is it
the
at?
username field. Yeah, if they put they put the password in the username field.
Oh, is that what it is? Yep. Could read uses passwords if they have been input incorrectly into the username field during login. Yeah, I don't know how I like necessarily feel about this one as much, right? Because it's, I guess anytime that we're taking input, especially if we haven't looked up, we don't know if it's a valid username, it's going to be a problem, right? But because
it's a hard one because Okta allows usernames and emails. I mean, it'd be one thing if you could sanitize by saying, if this is an email address, then don't. Or wait, if this is an email address, do log it, and if it doesn't match that format, don't, or mask bits of it. But
Yeah.
when it's a username, I suppose it comes down to what characters are disallowed in a username, uh,
Hmm.
if any. And yeah, because if there's if special characters are disallowed, and ideally the passwords are requiring a special character, I guess that would be like a signal.
But that's
But
just
yeah,
it.
it's
Like, it comes
definitely
down to what that
difficult.
special character is, right? Because a
Mm.
period, a plus sign, right? Like, both of those are valid email or valid username underscores, and they are considered special characters. So I don't know. I kind of have a hard time too with this idea that I'm logging a username when I haven't necessarily validated whether that user actually exists. Right. I think that's probably what I'd be talking about from a recommendation perspective. Is yeah.
Well, when we get to the Troy Hunt story, let's talk about what Cloudflare does to protect as an enterprise feature logs. And I think there's maybe a case here for keeping it the way it is, but then um, making it harder to access those logs, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
I saw Lintner just jumped on too on YouTube. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, it does seem like a reach to me. I think my initial like take on this was it was the password, password 1, password 2, password 3, where it's the username field. I'm like, I'm kind of with him here, right? Like, it is a little bit of a stretch, but I do see that, the possibility is happening, because I mean, we've all pasted passwords into Slack before, right? Or
yeah.
into other places where it was unintended. And so the risk does exist. How likely it actually is, whether it's going to be exposed, that's a whole, the impact of it, that's a whole other discussion on whether it's something you really need to prevent against. But that being
Well,
said,
actually,
this is Okta, right? This is Okta. This is not like my little like mobile app that I'm running, that I have a couple hundred users on. Like, it'd be interesting to see what that percentage actually is. What were you going to say?
I am curious as well. Like, what is the actual? Yeah, and Dave's not wrong. It's a little bit of a reach, though. You know what? I don't think we need to wait till the Troy Hunt story, but I can tell you when we talk about it, he mentions that Cloudflare, if you want to see the actual payloads of a request, because obviously that's super sensitive stuff, right? Then you use I believe, a public key kind of signature to validate your. So you upload a public key, and then that's what you use as a validation to retrieve those full logs. Feature only available to enterprise customers. So it
Yeah.
is protected and sensitive. Cloudflare's, defense, their protection is that you must be an admin role to access the logs. Obviously, yeah. I mean, it's AppSec. We don't look at that as a huge hurdle, but it is a hurdle and security boundary. But they could go that direction. That's all I was going
Yeah.
to say. If it was really a concern of the customers, and that's really what it comes down to, is it a concern of your customers in this case? I think, anyways. I think that's the deciding factor.
Yep. Yeah. And to Dave's point, lock down the logs, turn on MFA, and move on. Right. Like,
Right.
you're right. Right. Like, if you're using Okta and you don't have MFA enabled, right? Like, it's almost like shame on you. Right. But who's going to get access to those logs, where they're actually at? I mean, that should be a consideration, as it is, for an enterprise application or an enterprise in general. And then we can move on. I mean, the thing that makes me happy about this is that we're actually having this discussion, right? That there was somebody's actually posting about it. I was recently like looking at an application that was reporting, basically, the UI itself was responsible for recording session activity via an API endpoint, right? Which in and of itself doesn't sound that bad, especially from an analytics perspective. But the second that it starts to record, hey, I tried to log in, here's the session, or these were the transaction that this user was actually performing, and it's exposed via an API endpoint, it means that the logs can be messed with, right? Like, it's not necessarily that the UI itself isn't going to report that all up. It's the fact that in these single page applications like React, like, take your pick, Angular, whatever it is, or a mobile application, if the only logging mechanism that you have is via API or is via an API call, it means that as an attacker can, number one, hide what they're trying to do, right? Or by just flooding the log with all sorts of activity for a specific session while they attempt to do something bad. Or number two, they can just pause all their activity going to that API endpoint. And, at that point, they're hiding by just like not logging their activity, right? And so a lot of times we just don't take that into consideration. So my point here was I'm glad to see that we're actually having a discussion about it. That people are posting about the risks that do actually exist when it comes down to it. But we have ways to solve it, to Dave's point, right? Like we lock it down, we turn on MFA, and we're on to something else. We know how to solve it, but it seems like we continually make mistakes when it comes to logging infrastructure because it's almost an afterthought.
So would you summarize this as a something burger or a nothing burger?
Depends on the organization.
Right? Okay, all right.
I'm taking the easy way out. Yeah, not too polarizing. But
that's fair. That's fair.
I mean,
wait, sorry.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to actually say, right? But sometimes we have a 10. Yeah, it depends exactly. We'll make it a something burger for today. Maybe we'll start a burger or like a Crocs and socks, stamp that we put on things, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. It's contextual, we'll say.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of apps though at this point, right? Like impact really comes down to the organization itself and what they're concerned about, what's in the application. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. So next up, what do you want to talk about? You want to talk Troy?
Well, I've already talked.
Okay.
What's that?
Oh, go for it. You've already talked.
No. I was going to say I've already talked about the hinted at the Troy Hunt. So let's just talk about that one, and then we can. What does Crocs and socks mean? Yeah, actually, good point. We throw that around. There are new viewers. So TLDR. I mess with Seth for being an old dad, and old dads wear socks and Crocs. And whenever he talks about auditing and logging, I talk about it being one of the most boring topics as part of AppSec, and it's a total.
And I get all excited. Yeah,
and he gets excited. So that's the history there. For those who don't know.
So Crocs,
and pretty much every training
basics. Yep.
Okay, it comes up. All right. So sorry, I'm trying to scroll back to find this article because Seth and I had a lot of chatter this morning prepping for the show. So having to do a little bit more searching than usual. But I think Talos posted it, so it's already in our Slack. So I'll find the link here, but I'll just start talking about what it is. So the general gist is that Troy Hunt discovered that, some customers, a small percentage of customers were complaining that, they basically couldn't access the Have I Been Pwned API. They were being throttled and rate limited. So Troy did a little digging. He uses Stripe and he uses Cloudflare. When he looked at Stripe, and in Stripe, you can see, it's like a webhook delivery system. So if, there's a charge that happens, there's going to be some webhook event that sends an update about whether that failed or whether succeeded, and some metadata information, things like that. So in that log, it showed 403 responses when it was trying to charge a card. And that's significant because you're throttled by what your purchase plan is, right? So the 403 page showed a Cloudflare error page that said something, or forbidden page that said something about exceeded some I don't know, something about exceeded anomaly or exceeded anomaly detection or something along those lines. So he did a little bit more digging, looked at Cloudflare. When he looked at Cloudflare's logs, he saw that, as I had mentioned, you can't, for obvious reasons, the logs with all of the requests for the things you own don't just show up. You have to have an enterprise plan if you want to see the actual requests themselves and inspect them. And so that's kind of what he did. Didn't find anything super normal, but again, had noticed this like exceeded anomaly error message inside of, actually, sorry, before that, he saw the exceeded error anomaly inside of Cloudflare as well. And then he also then went and looked at the payloads, inspected them, didn't see anything, did notice a news update from Cloudflare saying, well, we keep in tune with the OWASP's mod WAF core rule set based off of its versioning. So if it version bumps, we then update our rules to match it. This is an interesting point, which I know Seth and I will get into here in a second. That's probably the most significant, interesting point of this whole thing, I think. In any case, 2 and 2 to go together. When did the error start happening? When did that update happen? They were at the same time. So again, obviously some kind of change to reflect OWASP's core mod rule set caused this issue. So again, inspecting the payloads, and he shows some snippets. There's nothing obvious that is like a SQL injection or a remote code execution attempt or anything like that. It's just not obviously there. So still, as far as I know, and I read the comments in the article as well, there's no update saying like, I mean, obviously the team's on it, but there's no update as to the root cause and like why that anomaly detection is occurring. But something in the update obviously caused it. So I'm sure more will come out there. But Seth, the reason I wanted to talk about this one is given that we had this realization and call to action for OWASP to fully support the projects that are clearly impacting the way the internet works. And two, I think it was Mark Curfew, if I am correct, it'd be Mark Curfew who was like, no, okay, I'm giving up my seat. I'm walking away. I think we need a new thing. And all this to say, it's all kind of culminating in like this interesting scenario where here you have this very well supported project. And again, I'm probably conflating things actually, it may just be like, this happens. I mean, honestly, WAF rule sets are very hard to not have something like this happen. So it's not to say that the project isn't like well supported or anything, but it is interesting that there's all these complaints about projects not being well supported. And then a project that's, again, like heavily relied upon by Cloudflare is like cause some major issues when it updated. So anyways, yeah, I think why I'm saying that is it just shows the fragility of everything once again that we rely on for the internet to work.
Yeah.
So anyways, with that having been said, what are your thoughts on this whole thing, Seth?
Yeah, I'm with Troy on like the digging that goes on, like running down. Like we always talk about rabbit holes, right? Like from a source code perspective, but this feels very similar to that, right? Like you find an issue and then trying to determine how something is actually implemented and how it actually works. Like we have a lot of leeway when we're doing an assessment on, calling something in scope or out of scope, just based on the time that we've got. But where he's trying to solve an actual customer problem, this is very development driven. And it's obviously an issue, but it's an edge case when you have multiple different technologies, multiple different providers in play, hard to actually test, hard to actually ascertain what's going on. And then when we get to something like the OWASP issue, this is so incredibly common in the open source space that we are reliant on a library or a function, whether that's out of date or even supported anymore, feels very true to life, right? Like when we are dependent on projects that were built. I mean, the mod security core rule set probably started 10 years ago at least, right? If I'm looking at their GitHub, right? And it's better than most that I look at, right? Like there's been activity within the last month, within the last year. There's a whole, there's thousands and thousands of commits. So it is like there's actually active development going on. But if you start digging into some of the package managers that are out there for Node, Python, Python libraries, you're going to find stuff that hasn't been updated in 5-10 years and is still considered core infrastructure for the internet at large. And so it's a larger discussion that we start to run into about the security of those libraries, of those projects, and the internet, like who's responsible for actually updating that, right? In this scenario, Troy is the one that's decided that he is using Cloudflare, right? Okay, so then it's on Cloudflare to solve that or Troy to solve that. But it's the interaction between Stripe and his site via Cloudflare that's causing the problem to pop up. And like, how often do we go in and put in these exceptions like he just did, right? Hey, I know it's not working, so I'm just gonna, I'm gonna whitelist all these IPs. It'll be fine, right? Like, it'll be okay. And in his case, it's probably gonna be just fine. Yeah,
I forgot about that detail.
But it's how we solve problems initially, is usually putting in some sort of an accept list or a, hey, this is allowed for now, until we can figure out what's actually going on. And I don't know if you're ever really going to be able to solve it, right? Like when it comes to some of those core libraries, you're kind of stuck, right? Like, if you're using some of the JavaScript, engines or whatever it is, or you're dependent on a very specific project, you use some of those libraries. So in his case, he's using Cloudflare. It's using the OWASP core rule set. And it was nothing that he did from update perspective that actually started causing the problem. It was Cloudflare / OWASP, and then the Stripe interaction for some reason is just triggering those rules, and you're done, right? You're done at that point.
And
I don't know.
An article that this just happened, something the same. Well, not the same, but a similar sort of like the fragility of our software systems. That Sam Altman, who by the way was on Lex Friedman. I want to check out that podcast with Lex Friedman. But anyways, this is a side note. Anyway, so Sam Altman from ChatGPT went on there and had basically apologized on Twitter for the I guess they some open source library they were using as part of ChatGPT allowed people to see the titles of other people's user conversations inside of for ChatGPT. So but Juan's point here was, and I want to say I agree with this. Like, it's hard to blame. Anytime as somebody who is currently in the midst of building a product, there should be, and there is for me anyways, a lot of consideration on what gets included inside of the application I'm building. However, I say that, but we all know how complex. I mean, we do. I don't know. Actually, as I think about it, it's like, well, sometimes that's part of the consideration, but sometimes those libraries do include a bunch of other stuff you really didn't expect. I mean, it's definitely part of the conversation, the consideration. It's the purpose around an SBOM, things like that. In any case, it should be a massive, or at least a decent conversation that you have when you decide to have core components rely on open source libraries you didn't build. So,
yeah, but
can't blame them. Is my point.
Yeah, but to that point, right? How often have you actually had that conversation about what your app is actually built on?
And I mean, I do, but I don't know how like other people.
Yeah. I mean, I know you do, right? But if I go into probably most of my clients, they don't start having that conversation until we start looking into their SBOMs, right? Or doing packet dependency analysis. And we're like, hey, you guys are using this old library. And they're like, oh, that's right. Right. We had a developer 6 years ago that really liked, whatever framework or, whatever library was out there, included it. And now it's a core piece of the functionality and we can't just rip it out, and upgrade paths are, screwed up. Right. So I would say large organizations do, disciplined developers definitely do.
But like the time they bring you, at the point they bring you in, though, they're already mature enough. Like in the early days, it's probably more YOLO, than that.
So, yeah, it is. It is a lot of YOLO.
Meaning, if I have the money and the time and the desire to bring you in, it's after I already have something that's like off the ground and running and good to go, right? It's not something that like, this is my day. I mean, very unlikely that it's my day 90 and I'm pulling you in With the sheer number, sorry, this let's see, with the sheer number of people using ChatGPT, they should be increasing their AppSec spend. Not say they. Oh, that's a hot take. I'd like to hear more about that. We can have David on so I can hear a little bit more. Sheer number of people using ChatGPT, they should be increasing their AppSec spend.
I was going to say they should just ask ChatGPT to, do some AppSec for them.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. I agree. Right. Like, I don't think they anticipated this level of scrutiny, right? Like, obviously, like wireless streams, I'm sure they did, that they wanted everybody to start using it. And it is training the model more and more. But I haven't necessarily even looked at, OpenAI, I'm sure has a bug bounty program, right?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So I don't know. I didn't have much else on that article. I just thought it, once again, it kind of highlights this whole situation of just relying on, and I just want to remind people, like, if you ever want to sponsor a project, I know it's not like the fix, but if you ever want to sponsor a project and it's sitting on, I don't know, I haven't checked on GitLab and Bitbucket, but GitHub does have a sponsor thing that you can give some money to a project if you would like.
Yeah,
you can have. So I don't know. Not saying that's going to fix everything, but if you ever want to support the ecosystems that support the internet, that's one way to do it. So,
yeah,
cool. So next article, actually, it's not an article. If you don't mind, I wanted to real briefly talk about the Twitter thread I saw. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So, and the reason I want to is not because of the drama aspect or whatever on there. It's actually because of the fact that we talk about this stuff. So, all right. So the TLDR here is that I don't want to try and pronounce, let's see, how do I, Osers, I don't know, whatever the handle is. Person A said, hey, the old auth bypass by editing HTTP responses from 302 to 200 never stops paying. 10 unique endpoints vulnerable to SQLi. So just to be clear, what we're saying is somebody modified the HTTP response code from 30 something, or redirection, to a 200. The page gets rendered in the browser. Because of this person discovered 10 endpoints they could interact with. And then when they did, those were vulnerable to SQL injection. So basically unauthenticated endpoints that were intended to be authenticated. Now, there's more there, but whatever. So then Live Overflow or Live Overflow, I'm not sure which one, person B will say, said, there is no such thing as an auth bypass by editing HTTP response. The only thing you might do is tricking the client UI to think you are authenticated. This could lead to easy identification of completely missing auth on endpoints, but you didn't bypass auth. Okay, so this is actually really not something I care to dig into, but there's a little bit more on that thread, them going back and forth, whatever. That's not, I don't care about any of it. Here's what I do care about. What they're trying to point out there is just the semantics, right? Like, it's not the auth bypass is not the modification of the response, though that is a good way to start interacting with the site through your browser. It is not the underlying root cause. It's just a way to get it to render in a way the browser won't just immediately redirect to off to wherever, and you can just have it rendered as a 200 and start putting things into form fields, whatever you want. You could do the same thing without obviously any browser. So, but what I think that's important to highlight is that this should be a part of people's test for sure. If it isn't, where you analyze response lengths. I mean, this is kind of back to AppSec 101 kind of stuff, to be honest. But we talk about it in our training course where there's these weird, like when you do source code reviews, we have this section on looking at your authorization decorators and analyzing what they do. And if anything, after a while, you create in your mind these weird sets of patterns that you're used to seeing. So like in .NET, for us, both Seth and I have seen redirect called a lot, but it's usually .redirect and then just an HTTP path as a string representation. So redirect parentheses string / path will say end parentheses. Very, very simple. In the case that we talk about in the course, I was doing a code review and saw an additional parameter added in called false. I had never seen that before when I looked it up. It was actually a way to say, well, we're not going to stop executing, right? Because normally redirect in the context of an authorization decorator just means, halt the chain of execution. So no more code should execute as part of the flow, meaning the flow is like from where the route gets defined to the sink, the last place it executes, typically a view where that gets rendered back to a user. And instead, don't do any of the rest of this stuff after this logic processing function, or this authorization decorator, rather, I should say. Authorization decorator. Stop doing stuff, redirect them, send a response with a redirect, don't do anything more. But when you put in false, it still does the 302. It still tries to redirect a user, but it is no longer a halt of code, halt the code from executing. It's not a hard barrier. It's not a hard line. It's like I said, just a redirect to the browser, but it still allows everything else to execute, to include building up a view template and responding with that. So that's why I wanted to talk about this Twitter thread, was just that this is a common thing. And, Seth, you found it from a dynamic standpoint because that was the test that you were running. They wanted a dynamic test. And I mean, it's probably in your methodology where you're just like sending, you could talk about how you do it, but I pretty much can guess, I'd imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it's looking at the redirects and actually investigating what's going on behind the scenes, what's actually being rendered, how the redirects act. Because we've seen it before that anytime the redirect response comes back and it looks different than the rest of the application, whether that's like it actually has a body or there's some headers that we didn't expect, that you're starting to get into those edge cases where the redirect fail can actually occur, outside of what, of this thread where they're looking for, hey, is there authentication missing on any endpoints, which is realistically what they're digging into there. But it's also right, like, those edge cases are always a fun thing to actually take a look at. And to your point, Ken, right, like when we talk about redirects, redirect is a very significant security control when it comes to web applications in general, because it is the mechanism by which we send clients some other place. And we've, I mean, how many times have we been able to abuse redirects to send people to a malicious site rather than the login page, or like send them to our site and then where we can steal the credentials and send them back, right? Like there's different ways that those redirects can actually be used to target an application. So it should be in your methodology at some point to take a look at those anytime that behavior exists. Yeah. And the same thing with like OAuth flows and single sign-on. The way that dance happens is it's very easy to make a mistake. And hey, I can introduce I can give you a sign-in link for my application or your application, but I changed the redirect to something else. It looks similar. It ends up posting the creds back to me, or it redirects the user back to me, right? Like all of this stuff is, very security sensitive.
Yeah, auth flows they don't really have state in a sense. So it's with single sign-on, I think the most you usually see is like maybe nonce checking, right, as a client. But it's not true state in that sense. It's a bunch of different things you're supposed to call in a certain order with codes being exchanged for authenticity's sake. So you're right. It's a weird. Endpoints are weird. You gotta know what are accessible, and yeah, it's always a tough one.
Yeah.
So, and redirection plays a part in exploiting it.
Yeah. And that's just it, right? Like knowing what the surface of your application is honestly half the battle. There's a reason that we spend so much time doing information gathering, that we use the application as a user does, start to identify where that outer edge of an application lives, and those interaction points between, okay, authenticated, unauthenticated, one service and another service, right? Like all of those are exposure points where security is typically weaker. And this is it's no fault necessarily of the developers, because most of the time the core functionality, the business logic works as expected, but they've never thought through what that looks like. They've been given, okay, here's a key, you interact with this service, this is how you do X, Y, and Z, here's the library that we use that actually interacts or does our OAuth flow for us, and don't realize that there's security implications in the way that's actually set up. And man, we're going all over the place, Ken, right?
That's good. That's what we're here for, man. We're supposed to go all over the place. That's what we do. That's what we do. Well, I do have another very interesting one for us to talk through. It's not too technical, but it's technical enough.
Do you want to address that in Slack? Juan and Talos are talking about the Twitter open source, right?
Oh gosh, yeah. There's
the
that.
Code leak.
Man, that was all over the headlines. You want to give a TLDR? I mean, I know about it too, but it's you brought it up, so by all means, good sir. If you want to give a TLDR there, a little summary.
The Twitter source code was leaked on GitHub, right? And let me see if I can find a link for it. Right. Of course, the first one I click on is not. They're trying to find the culprit, and of course, there's like sad images of Elon everywhere, right? Because that's the, it's his source code, right? But
what do you think the ramifications of? Oh well, actually, let me stop. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yes, proprietary source code for Twitter's platform internal tools. I haven't even tried to look for the source code. I'm sure it's up on the deep web now if you want to take a look at it. Or there's other places. I mean, this happens to all large platforms at some point. And this goes back to kind of the threat model that you create for your application. It's a matter of when it gets breached, not if. At some point, source code is going to be disclosed. We've seen this Twitter is just the latest. Microsoft, take your pick, and whether it's coming from a disgruntled employee, an ex-employee, right? It sounds like Juan's got a little bit more information there. Alleged employee, without no auth controls, non-existent. Somebody else, Talos was saying that another podcast was saying that all devs had access to all production machines in Twitter, right? Like there's not a huge separation of duties, basically, is what I'm getting out of this. But the implications are pretty wide from a trust perspective, because what would you and I do if we had access to source code? What's the first thing that you're going to start doing?
Look for vulnerabilities. Yes. Why? What else am I getting? Well, actually, sorry. I'm going to open up a file. I'm going to start taking notes, and then
I'm going to put a commit hash at the top of that.
I'm going to put a commit hash at the top, and then I'm going to start doing my assessment. That's what I'm going to do in that order.
Yes. In that order. Yes. There we go. That was a sneak preview for Practical Secure Code Review. KernelCon, a couple weeks.
No, but excuse me, geez. But what I didn't understand was the rumors around Elon being like, well, what was the legal term they said? Something about a deposition, or I don't know, something like that, which is like, not a deposition. That can't be right. That would be no. Let's see, disgruntled. Also, somebody leaked their source code. Elon was requesting a subpoena. Right? Somebody mentioned a subpoena for GitHub.
Mm-hmm. That they want to know who it was, right? Yeah.
But as a paying customer, you're gonna know who that is. So I'm like, what are they talking about? A subpoena? Like, meaning not the person in Slack that said it, but the rumor going around that he would want a subpoena, like. You get to know that information as a paying customer. So I'm not sure. And even still, you would imagine that Twitter, I actually don't know this, right? Well, I guess I don't know, it's supposed to post it on GitHub, and it's obviously not a GitHub on-prem situation, I would imagine. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think you need a subpoena is my point for that at all. I think you're a paying customer. You have access to know who did that. Now that's under your organization. If somebody created an account and then posted it under their own account, I don't know how exactly the rules work there, but I still doubt that a subpoena would be needed. But I don't know. because that is obviously an area that is actually, believe it or not an area that I ever got into, was the legality behind giving over that kind of information. We have a whole support system for that. So not something I was ever privy to. And so anything I comment on, it's just me guessing.
It's you guessing. Well, it's interesting, right? Because if you go to GitHub to that actual account, right, that did the leaking, like it's funny. It says repositories 1, but there's no repositories to actually search, right? Or it doesn't actually show up. So it's definitely, it's been taken down. Not following anyone. The thing is, like, this is a social media platform. Anyone can sign up for an account as long as you have an email, right? Like, it's just one of those things that I'm like, you wonder how much detail is actually going to be available there, right? You wonder what you're going to actually be able to determine. And this is where it comes down to blast radius. If I'm Twitter, is the payoff there to actually go after who it is? I mean, from a legality perspective, you've got to protect your IP and, what you've actually created. You're going to take it down, but it's out there at this point, right? Like, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. There's no, you've got to contain the blast is where you're actually at this point. If you haven't been doing code reviews from a security perspective, you better start doing it now. Anything that hasn't been solved, that's been on the backlog as a security issue, hey, probably just took a higher priority. Because realistically, that's going to be the case, right? Like, I'm trying to think through the steps that I would actually take if it was my source code that was compromised in this manner, or an organization that I work with. And that's what I'm going to start going to is, all right, there are significant pieces of security that are controlled by this source. Do we need to start changing things up? Do we need to look at the authentication and authorization mechanisms and maybe recreate that, move to a new platform if we're right? Like, just because we don't know what we don't know about that source, it's going to cause quite a few changes from a security control perspective in the codes that I have.
Yeah. You're right. You're absolutely right. Oh man. Well, it's going to be a fun time. Well, and then who knows, like, what time Twitter can devote to, who knows? The whole thing seems very, very messy for sure. Though at the end of the day, if it was, well, whatever. It seems messy. That's what I'll leave it at, I think.
Yeah.
So,
well, what hasn't been messy about that whole acquisition, and the way everyone's involved. So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose we don't need to talk about it too much, but since you already mentioned GitHub, and I got to be honest with you, I already know GitHub's going through a little bit of a rough time. There's stuff going on over there. But anyways, this is the other one. Again, not a big deal, but might as well mention it just because it did happen, and it is GitHub specific and all that. But it looks like at some point the SSH key, the SSH host key was exposed and not great. So it was redacted very temporarily, but just out of an abundance of caution, they they removed that key. So now when you go to SSH or do GitOps or anything, I would imagine anyways, with GitHub, you'll see an error there about the host mismatch, and then everybody just has to kind of accept that. So it's not super fun, but it's also not the most notable thing in the world. It's just kind of a thing that happens. Stuff happens. And I know, and I can tell you from having worked there, it doesn't matter if it was a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second that it was exposed. It doesn't matter even if it was only on an internal system. They will just immediately take the harshest line, in a good way, the hardest line to protect those types of things, and make hard decisions where you have to like publicly admit it, and then people have to like do stuff for a second, and you have to write a post and do all the incident response stuff, but they'll do all that. So I would actually say, and this, of course I'm biased. I worked there for long enough to be biased. And, but I will say like they're staying true to who they've been the whole time I've known GitHub in terms of how they treat security stuff. So
Yeah.
I would almost say, if it's going to happen, this is a positive outcome.
So a nothing burger. That's what you're saying here. This is just Crocs.
It's a nothing burger. It's just all over the news, and like there's not a huge news cycle right now. So the stuff like Twitter and the stuff like that, it's all kind of getting a lot of press right now. It's fine, but understand that it's probably just because not probably. I mean, it hasn't been the I don't think it's been the craziest news cycle, honestly, of interesting things from my reading this morning, trying to dig stuff up. So now, but we've got 15 minutes left, almost 16 or 14. So I want to like get to this one because I think it's actually interesting. Let me put this in general.
Oh, yes.
So it's a technical post. Technical in the sense that they dig into a vulnerability that I have seen, which is why I wanted to bring it up. But it's cool that someone's talking about it. So the TLDR on this one is that when you have, especially in today's world, distributed systems, you often have multiple proxies or front-end systems sitting in front of back-end systems. Now, there are headers that get sent or don't get sent, but get added upon each hop, removed and added upon each hop to a proxy or a front-end system. And I say or a front-end system because this is where I saw it, and I won't go into which product I saw it on, but I'll talk about it in a second. So, all right. For proxy specifically, there's like a set of headers, and the article shares those headers that when they're received by a proxy, the proxy's job is to remove those headers, to process, parse, and remove those headers. And then if they need to add any other headers for the next hop, they'll do that and then forward that request on, right? Pretty simple.
Yep.
But there, in one example, say the connection header, what he noticed, and I don't remember if this was Nginx or Varnish or what it was, but one of those systems had, or both had, they treated the connection header as if I appended a second header to the connection line, then it could be forwarded on to the backend systems. Now you could put an entirely different separate key value pair header inside the connection key value pair, and then that would make its way all the way to the backend system. Now, why does this matter at all? And that's just one example. They talk about using it for fingerprinting, for DNS cache poisoning, for a few things, right? Why is this? And for bypassing access control, which brings me to my like experience with this. So what I was seeing is a microservice in a part of one of our products, a suite of microservices with a front end that does all the authorization and the back end does the actual processing, but it makes no real authorization decisions other than to say, are you authorized? And if so, like, cool. Anything you sent me must be good. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the front end parsed, and maybe I've talked about this before. I'm not sure, but the front end parsed the request, stripped out what it thought were the parts of that request that were the bits that mattered for authorization, like can you do this thing on this object? And then it parsed, it repackaged the request in a different way, added some headers, did some stuff, forwarded onto the back end services. But the problem was that someone had figured out that those weren't the only parts of the request that you could use to make a determination on the thing you update. So just as an example, we'll say that the path value was what was matched up against the token value. And they said, well, you're allowed to hit that path, or the parameter in the path, I should say, or like a RESTful parameter. Like you're okay to access that object. That's cool. What they failed to realize is that if you also added another header with what would be the same thing as that parameter in the RESTful path, then that would actually be by the backend system acknowledged as the actual value that they need to match up to the user and say, they don't do any authorization decisions. They just say this user wanted to update this thing. They're okay. Front end said they're okay. But again, there was a mismatch of what parts of the request. And I see this as a thing that keeps happening as we get more distributed with our systems, where there is this like set of decisions that are supposed to be like offloaded to a front end, and then the back end's not supposed to have to think about those things. Kind of makes sense. The only issue is, like I said, and like this article points out, is there's key parts of requests that are very important. So if you are using different libraries to parse and then repackage and, fiddling with headers and all of these things, you're going to inevitably have a logic flaw issue. So that's a long rant-winded, whatever you want to say, way of kind of breaking that all down. But I think it's very, very fun article to read. I will say the article I had to reread. I don't know if it was just morning brain or whatever, but man, I had to reread certain parts of it like 7 times before I was like, oh, I understand what you mean. So I'm not sure if that's on me, but overall the content itself, the technical merit seemed pretty cool. So
Yeah.
Have you experienced this, Seth? Have you seen things like these? What is your take here?
From an API perspective, this feels so super common to me, whether it's like method interchange, like HTTP method interchange, like a get or a post that allows that control, headers, right? Like defined headers are always an issue when it comes to what is it that you're actually updating with that API, what's controlled as it goes through the proxy, how that authentication and authorization happens. I think the biggest place that I see it most recently is GraphQL, right? Like just the way that GraphQL does its authorization is very similar because it'll do authorization based on one query lookup that's actually in a GraphQL request, and then assume that everything else follows that same pattern when it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the case, or they shouldn't have access to some certain object that's embedded 3 or 4 levels deep. So it's like authorization is hard, right? Like this is always going to be an issue, and it's not one that's easily solved, especially when we have multiple different technologies in play. Right? Like that was, I think I talked about that with the like percent, the URL encoding in the path as well. When you're starting to line up these different technologies, I can see this being very similar.
You did,
but it is, yeah. It's very interesting to actually see the headers that are passed along what's considered hop by hop versus a what do they call the other one? Hop by hop versus endpoint. I don't know. I'll have to pull up the RFC specifically, right? Like, yep, end to end versus hop by hop headers, right? And then the ability, especially in the different HTTP protocols, to define headers as either endpoint or hop by hop and have the proxy honor that. Right? That's, and so I can see where the mistakes are actually going to happen, because the definitions on that front end proxy may not line up again with the technology on the back end, with the app itself and the configuration. If you're just taking whatever comes from your Docker pull or your Docker instance, or take your configuration file, with a grain of salt, is basically where I wanted to go with that.
Yeah.
Let me see.
I just feel like this is I like this article. I like the naming of it, but that the concept behind these mismatches, it's prevalent. It's whether it's these specific headers and the way that, the order of operations here, or if it's just a different HTTP library parsing things, because you have different tech stacks, right? Usually in a distributed services, you've got a difference in languages and frameworks between some of the services. They're not all, it's rare that you walk in and everything's all the same, especially in a distributed services kind of system. So distributed, I can't talk today, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Well, I keep playing with this, right? Like, because X forwarded for is always an interesting one. That's a nice abuse case, right? Like 192 or 127, right? Like you'll be surprised what you can actually get to there. RFC 1918 spaces, fingerprinting, cache poisoning. Like he's talking about all the different things that they've done with this, right?
Some of them are theoretical, but they would work.
Yeah, the WAF rule bypass, that's one that's always going to be fun. Which should be
Yeah, I thought of you when I
yeah,
saw that too, by the way.
yeah. Those yeah. Anytime that you've got regular expressions, right, there's always the possibility to introduce something into that request uh, that bypasses the regular expression, right? That's, it's a lot of regular expression abuse. So
Yeah.
further research needed. Yeah, like part of me wants to go start playing with those connection and those different headers as they're in there, right? Um,
Yeah, it
xvarn
makes sense.
sorted
Yeah.
for, because he's right that they are right, whoever that is. That space is not one that's been regularly like included in research topics, right? There's like edges of this that I've touched on in the past, but it
Right.
always seems like, every time I read one of these articles, I'm like, crap, now I need to add another, 3 or 4 things into my checklist of we need to check for this, right? But it's good, right? That's part of the research aspect that we have here.
It's part of why we do this podcast.
Exactly.
But it's interesting. I feel like, truthfully, I feel like if this was if there was still a Daily Swig, we'd be seeing soon a James Kettle article on how to mass detect these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah.
so cool. That's all I had, Seth. By the way, in terms of articles, so I don't know if you've got anything else queued up that you wanted to chat about.
Not necessarily, not today. Because we are kind of hitting up against time. So I think I would rather, yeah. Let's, yeah. If you have something that you want to talk about, you've been listening today, please jump into Slack. I know we push it all the time, but that's because there is a good community that's in there. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on, especially during the week, that we don't necessarily even address on the podcast. Whether it's posting of a job or like posting that you're available, looking for work, there's a good network that's become available and a good community that's built up. We really appreciate everyone that jumps in and contributes and speaks up and presents those articles to us as well. It's great to see. So,
Actually, let me
James,
plug something too. You
yeah,
should. I'm glad you mentioned that because it made me think. There's a lot of people being laid off right now. I'm security. You'll see it on GitHub, Microsoft. They've kind of done some layoffs. Other companies are doing layoffs as well. I say that because if you are not doing layoffs and your company is doing well, this is a great time to start scooping up talent. If their loss is my kind of take there, right? So, anyways, just I don't know. Post on our jobs channel if you're looking for a role. Post on the jobs channel if you have an open role. I'd say even start watching your Twitter feed because a lot of people are talking about, if they were laid off, they'll post it there. But yeah, just be mindful of that if you're not already. If you're hiring, especially if you're a hiring manager.
yes. I'm getting one response say that they got an error with the Slack link, but I know I have had people comment. If you're having a problem with Slack, just contact Ken or I or Seth at absoluteappsec.com, and I'll send you an invite directly. That's probably the easiest way to take care of it.
I have to
Sometimes it
say
works,
for
sometimes it
anybody,
doesn't.
I was gonna say for everybody, like we have these links. We set these links up, and like 99% of the time it's fine, and every once in a while it just stops working. And it's briefly. It's not like we have to rotate a link as far as I know anymore. It's just that Slack has some issue or something like that. So most of the time it's kind of wait a few minutes and you'll be all right, or wait a day or whatever. But sometimes still let us know because sometimes it has in the past a couple of times been something we had to actually fully rotate. So just let us know if
Yeah.
it doesn't go away after a day or whatever.
Yep. I am posting another link into Slack chat. Actually, it was Portswigger. It was a bug bounty finding for Burp Suite that is fairly interesting. Basically, file inclusion attack through the copy as curl command, right? Like, so you copy a post as curl, but realized that there was one of those parameters that allows for inclusion of files. So I'm posting that in there. It was an interesting one, right? Like no one is immune to vulnerabilities and issues. And, especially again, you're using multiple different forms of tech. Don't realize that, hey, there is a parameter that does some parsing by curl and it'll pull files from the local file system. If you attach an @ sign to it, of all things, it's since been fixed, but go read that one as well. Here, I'll throw it in just as a final here too. It's not part of Daily Swig, but it was some Portswigger research that came out within the last few days. So, cool. Yeah. Anyways, that'll do it for today. Again, this episode was sponsored by Redpoint Security, code security by coders. And yeah, if anyone's looking for assessment code review by a third party, reach out to Redpoint, info@redpointsecurity.com. Yeah. Ken, I think that's everything for today, unless you have any final thoughts before we close it out.
No, I was just looking at the data binary flag of the curl command that allows for that file inclusion. Sorry. So you got me. You nerd sniped.
I've got him. Yeah, I know I did.
At the end of the show.
There we go.
Okay, cool. I actually want to read more about that one. So cool. Thanks everybody for listening. I don't have anything else.
Okay.
Yeah, just happy. I can't wait for KernelCon. It's 2 weeks away. Sorry if I'm annoying people by tweeting a lot of. I'm trying not to retweet everything they post, but once in a while they post something every few days. It's cool and I retweet it. So, anyways, I'm very excited about KernelCon. Should be a really good time. 2 weeks away. Yeah.
Sweet. All right. We'll see everybody there. Catch everybody soon. Thanks.
See you later.